Nothing quite like being put on the spot before you've had your coffee. But I just want to tell you what a marvelous day it was yesterday. The quality of the presentations, seeing the energy in the room, listening to the discussions. I am so completely jet lagged, but it was such a treat. So I cannot even begin to tell you just how excited I am to join the Institute and to work with and get to know all of you better once I arrive here in January. So thank you. And thank you for all your efforts in Dr. Daftovich for organizing such a marvelous conference. Thank you.
So I hand over the panel to Fârès to start our next day, the second day of the program. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's my honor to chair the first panel of this second day. So we were supposed to start with Professor Poonawala, who has not arrived yet. So we will start with Professor Walker, who will present a talk entitled The Dangers of Doctrinal Interpretations of Key Concepts and Events in Ismaili History. Thank you.
Let me begin with a small confession. When I saw the program of the conference, I was reminded that in my lifetime, Ismaili studies has gone from very little to flourishing, and it's getting bigger and bigger all the time. And we are, in my estimation, approaching a degree of maturity that is striking for the field and is a good omen. And I define maturity as when we are so many people that we have at least two people working on the same topic, so that we are correcting each other's mistakes, and that will only improve the total outcome in the end. Now, noticing what the program is, the state of the field, I decided that what I should do is to offer something that is a little bit of advice about maybe a small defect that still exists in the work we do. And I'll begin by saying we're all in the business of interpreting. That's what we as historians do. We gather our sources, we bring them together, we study them, and then we write about them. And it's all a process of interpretation, even translating. Any kind of translating from one language to another is interpretation. It's unavoidable. But what I'm going to advise against, or at least offer some caution, is when the interpretation is based on doctrine and not on evidence. Now, these situations arise, we're all guilty of it, and in some respects, it's unavoidable. But it should be, we at least should be transparent and aware of when it occurs. And so I'm going to offer some advice or some examination of places where it might be happening. Sometimes it's a case of ambiguity, sometimes it's case, the worst, when there's simply no evidence to support it. Instead of having a kind of abstract discussion of this, I decided that it would be best if I offered you 4 cases so you could see it in specific context and you can all relate to those specific contexts and we can discuss what's happening in these various places. So my first one is not so consequential, but it's the matter of the personal name of the first Fatimid caliph. Was it Abdullah or was it Ubaydullah? Now, you obviously know that all Ismailis and probably everybody in the room would prefer Abdullah, thinking that the use of the term Ubaydullah is derogatory since it's a diminutive. But do we know for sure one way or the other? And is it so consequential that we need to insist on Abdullah? For example, is the diminutive actually a pejorative, or is it intended to diminish his stature? Hussein is a diminutive. Nobody ever says anything about the name Hussein, but somehow in the case of al-Mahdi, the first caliph, the idea that he's called Ubaydullah is taken to be something invented by his enemies in North Africa, particularly the Malikis and other writers who wanted to demean him, and therefore they picked Ubaydullah on purpose. Well, maybe that is the case, but can we actually establish on the basis of some kind of evidence? And what I would like to point out is, among other things, that the name al-Mahdi Billah is a title. It's a laqab. It's an honorific. It's not a personal name. So people who don't agree that he was an imam and a person to be honored need to refer to him by a personal name. This is a very common practice. So they can say, oh yeah, that Joe Schmo, who pretends to be a caliph or an imam or something like that. So al-Mahdi Billah is not his name, and we need a name, or in certain contexts, the name would be important. Now, one other factor which is kind of interesting is that one of the authorities that you can consult on the history of the Fatimids is al-Maqrizi, the Egyptian historian. And al-Maqrizi had nothing bad to say about al-Mahdi. He admired the man, and yet he insists all the way through his Itiaz al-Hunafa on using Ubaydullah. He had to have been sensitive and know what was at stake in this. And in fact, in his biography of al-Mahdi, he offers a discussion of 7 different names, personal names, that were applied to al-Mahdi. But he prefers Ubaydullah. Well, in the end, I couldn't find any way. Al-Mahdi himself once ordered that all names be removed from bridges, cisterns, everything else in this realm, and his own name be put on it. But as far as I know, none of those survived. So we don't have that kind of evidence to make a correction and determine a final outcome here. So maybe the best policy, okay, if you want, you use Abdullah. If you want to be a little more accurate, you say Abdullah parentheses Ubaydullah, or Ubaydullah parentheses Abdullah. But the outcome will mean that if you're doing Encyclopedia of Islam 3, the entry will be either alphabetized under A or U. So it can be a big difference. Okay, let me move on to a second one where there is a hotly contested debate, and it's quite complex, and that is the dating of the Risal of the Ikhwan al-Safa. So before I say anything more, let me say that long ago, when I first was aware of the issues about the dating of the Risal, I swore to myself I would never touch the subject. I would have nothing to do with the Risal. Since then, I've edited 3 of the treatises in the volume. I've written the entry in the Encyclopedia Iranica, which, by the way, is filed alphabetized under E for Ikhwan. But in any case, way back then, the people who were most important in mentoring me and introducing me to Ismaili studies were Abbas Hamdani and Wilfred Madeline. Some of you will immediately realize what my dilemma was. So Abbas Hamdani was, for most of his considerable career, trying very hard to push the dating of the Risal earlier and earlier, trying to make it reach back far enough to match the Tayyibi legend or doctrine, whatever it is, that the Risal were, if not written, but at least put into circulation by Ahmad, the second of the hidden imams. So that would push it back to the 9th century, maybe it's the early second half of the 9th century. His notion was that these Risala were created partly and circulated partly to lay the groundwork for the coming Fatimid Revolution. Okay, on the other side is Wilfred Madelung, who was following Stern's discovery of the names and the details about the people who actually wrote the Risale in Basra that would be still active at the time of al-Tawhidi, who gives that report. So that would date it to the middle of the second half of the 10th century. This is a considerable difference. Well, where do we fall into this between the two of these? But you can see that one is doctrinal and one is based on some kind of evidence. So we can examine all of the evidence that Abbas produced in order to discredit any of the arguments that had to be late and tried to push it back to an earlier date. I can add here a footnote that Maribel Ferrero has come up with yet another thing which is not doctrinally connected at all with the Ismailis, but she wants to argue for the involvement of Maslam al-Qurtubi, which would push it back to the beginning of the 10th century, something like that. Well, I can't resolve this. I would just say that Ismail Poonawala is the last one to give a detailed examination of all of this in his introduction to Epistle 41. So if you want to see a very vigorous defense of Abbas's position, then you should go to that thing. I think his formula is the Risale were written and put in circulation after al-Kindi, but before al-Farabi. That's another dating. Well, let me move on from there to something which is much more consequential, and that is the question of whether al-Mustansir designated Nizar as the successor imam. So if you look at what people have written and who makes a claim, you will see that there is a tendency among certain of our luminary authors, some of the best, to simply say it's a known fact that al-Mustansir designated Nizar. Okay, and here I'm citing Marshall Hodgson, Bernard Lewis, and Farhad Daftari. So Hodgson says, Nizar, who had been known to have been designated by al-Mustansir as the future imam. Okay, Lewis, Nizar, the eldest son and adult already appointed heir by al-Mustansir, known and accepted by the Ismaili leaders. Daftari, al-Mustansir had initially designated his eldest son Abu Mansur al-Nizar. Nizar, who had received Mustansir's nas, was thus expected to succeed him. Another quote, it is a historical fact that Nizar's succession rights were never revoked by al-Mustansir. Well, if there was no designation at all, then there was nothing to revoke. So what is the evidence for a designation? None of these authors ever have a footnote. They do not cite an event, a time, a place, any of the details that would be necessary for us to understand that this designation actually happened. You can't just say it's a known fact. It needs to be based on some kind of report somewhere that says that al-Mustansir designated his eldest son Nizar. Well, okay, I'm not here to resolve the question of whether in fact Nizar was designated and that he was the true imam, but as historians, what we should say, and probably the best way to put it, is apparently Nizar had reason to believe that he had been selected and designated by his father And he acted upon that knowledge. And then when he could get safely to Alexandria, he proclaimed his imamate. That's a considerably different, but it's a much more cautious way to approach it. The claimed designation on his deathbed, which al-Afdal announced, is, of course, quite suspicious. But to say that that is a second designation requires that you establish that there was a first designation. It could have been the only designation. So we've got a monumental split between Zaris and Tayyibis on this very issue. So it needs to be approached with suitable caution. Well, let me go on quickly to the final of my 4 cases, and that is the exact affiliation of the famous Shahrastani. Was he Ismaili or not, in any sense? Was he intellectually? Was he? Okay. Well, this one is very complicated and takes a lot of discussion, and I could go on for quite a while to explain everything. So I won't try to do that, but I simply say that I am about to publish in the Journal of the American Oriental Society my complete review of all of the evidence. And my conclusion is that there is none to prove that the man himself was an Ismaili. But let me bring up just 2 things which are often neglected and overlooked. The first is that it's very common to say, because Shahrastani could offer an Arabic translation of the 4 propositions that lie at the core of Hassani Sabah's Fusul al-Arba, his treatise, that he must have had special access, some kind of connection to Alamut, and that he knew it in that way. But as much as 2 decades before Shahrastani, Ghazali gained access to the same treatise by Hassani Sabah. And he wrote his own refutation of it in Persian, like the original. So not only, Shahrastani is not evidence of special access, and we also have to consider the fact that maybe Shahrastani knew the treatise by Hassani Sabah through Ghazali's refutation of it. That's just speculation. But it is a case that this is a key piece of material that needs to be put into the equation. And finally, another one. People look at what Shahrastani wrote about the Ismailis in his Milal wa Nihal. It's very prominent and it's very interesting, but it consists of 2 parts. There is the second part on the new dawah that's instigated by Hassani Sabah, the Ta'lim argument. And he has various things to say about Ta'lim argument. Well, there's a first part. I ask you all at some point, if you have not done it, look seriously what he says is the old dawah of the Ismailis. There's nothing in it that is classical Ismailism. Nobody looks at it. Okay, I'm going to give you an example, but so much of it, when you go through very, very carefully, you will see that a lot of it is not. My conclusion is Shahrastani knew nothing of the old doctrine. He was only familiar with the Ta'lim doctrine because he's writing 4 decades after Hassani Sabah shut down the old dawah. So the only thing left was the Ta'lim, the simple Ta'lim argument. In any case, so Shahrastani made up and attributed to the Ismailis. I'm baffled. I don't know what he's doing, but it's really strange. Okay, so here is a key item. So by God's command, he created the intellect first, which is fully in act, in actu, bilfil. So through the medium of intellect, he next created soul, second, which is not fully in act. It's not perfect. It's not fully developed. The relationship between the soul and the intellect is that of sperm to the fully developed creature, or like that of an egg to a bird, or that of a child to its parents, and so on. In the celestial world, there is a universal intellect and a universal soul, which has just been described. That standard Neoplatonic description. There must therefore be in this world a particular individual intellect which is also universal, and whose authority is the authority of the one person having the fullest measure of perfection. He is known as the lawgiver, the prophet. Nothing wrong there. That would even be accepted by a Sijistani. There must also be a particular individual soul, which too is universal, but whose authority is like that of a child, still imperfect, but advancing toward perfection, or like the sperm on its way to full development, or like the female paired with the male. That soul is called the Imam. Does that make any Ismaili sense? I think not. That says that the Imam is imperfect, that he has to acquire a perfection. I think this is a Sunni doctrine. Anyway, that shows you how suspicious this whole passage is that Shahrastani offers in the names of the Ismailis. Well, the ultimate conclusion in the case of Shahrastani, and I would defer here to our host, is that, yes, eventually the Ismailis adopt Shahrastani. It's not that he himself was an Ismaili, but eventually, at the time of Nasruddin Tusi, he's become an Ismaili, at least among the Nizari Ismailis. Well, anyway, those are examples of where we need caution in treating these things. And the problem is that sometimes doctrine intercedes, and we need to be at least transparent when we are engaging in that kind of discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this presentation, which is bound to spark a debate. We're now going to listen to Professor Shafique Virani, who will present a talk entitled Pir Sabzali and the Missing Sources of Ismaili History.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by telling you a story from my first year as an undergraduate university student. I used to love my English literature class. One day, I rushed home bursting to tell my parents about an essay we had read from a book called Decolonizing the Mind. Unlike most of the authors we studied, this author was from Africa, like us. He wrote of his happy childhood listening to stories in his native Gikuyu language. However, everything changed when the colonial regime made English the language of instruction. In Kenya, the author wrote, English became more than a language. It was the language, and all the others had to bow before it in deference. The teachers caned on bare buttocks any children caught speaking Kikuyu, or made them wear a sign around their necks saying, I am stupid, or I am a donkey. How did the teachers catch the culprits? They would give a button to an offending student who would snare the next pupil speaking his mother tongue. That pupil passed the button on to the next guilty friend, and so on. At the end of the day, the teacher summoned the last disgraced rascal who had the button, who then had to identify all the previous guilty parties. In this way, the children not only learned how shameful it was to speak their mother tongue, but also how to tattle on their own kind. The real tragedy, the author held, was not simply that the regime had colonized their countries, but that it had colonized their minds. The native people came to despise their own languages and cultures and believed that even they themselves were inferior to their colonizers. My parents' eyes grew wider and wider as I told them about this essay. "Who's the author?" my father asked. Pulling out my book, I read the unfamiliar name, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. My father's jaw dropped. He said, "Ngugi was my schoolfellow." This incident had a profound impact on me. I began to realize how my own mind had been colonized. How often had I spoken to my parents and my grandparents in hushed tones so that nobody would hear that we didn't speak English? How often had I told my younger siblings not to call me Ba in public? The episode also makes me keenly aware that our academic field, Islamic studies, has its own colonial mentality, one that permeates Arabic, the classical period, Sunni Islam, and their imagined normative value. Ismaili studies has inherited many of these biases, and it's something that needs to change, or else we stand to lose a great deal. As a scholar who has focused primarily on Arabic and Persian in my own research, in this paper I want to advocate for the value of other sources of Ismaili history, thought, and creativity. I want to speak about the urgency of preserving traditions in Saraiki, Punjabi, Gujarati, Sindhi, Kutchi, Hindi, Urdu, Swahili, Burushaski, Shina, Khwar, Waki, Shugni, Rushani, and many, many others. I'll do this by focusing on the example of Gujarati and using the figure of Pir Sabzali to demonstrate the richness and variety of sources available, their value, and the challenges of working with them. Long before our times, the value of seeking wisdom from wherever it may come was emphasized by Hakim Nasir Khusrau, who set out across the world on his famous journey in search of knowledge. He writes, "From Persian and Arab, from Hindi and Turk, from Sindhi, Byzantine and Hebrew, from all bar none, from philosopher and Manichaean, from atheist and Sabian, I asked for what I sought, inquiring incessantly." In Islamic studies, one of the greatest landmarks of inquiring incessantly is the Encyclopedia of Islam. In the preface, the publishers describe it as, quote, "unsurpassed in size, authority, and erudition." One of its harshest critics, though, was Marshall Hodgson, a giant in both Islamic and Ismaili studies. He decried Islamic studies for its, quote, "Arabistic bias," reflected in book after book and article after article, not least in the Encyclopedia of Islam. Elton Daniel, the editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia Iranica, provides teeth to this critique in his article about the Encyclopedia of Islam, noting that the minor Syrian city of Hims is given more than double the space of major Muslim centers outside the Arab world, such as Qom, Mashhad, Ankara, and Jakarta. He writes, "While there may be a defensible rationale for such a bias, it is regrettable to the extent that it gives the impression that Islam is a fossilized museum relic rather than a vital, living, developing, multifaceted entity, and that what is significant and normative about it is determined by its proximity to Arabism, Sunnism, the Mediterranean lands, philological methodology, and pre-modern periods." In recent decades, Persian has been making headway to assume its rightful place in Islamic studies, not least with the leadership role that the IIS has taken in the Encyclopedia Islamica project, translating the ambitious Persian Da'irat al-Ma'arif-e-Buzurg Islami. Turkish and Urdu have been making some minor gains, while studies of materials in languages such as Gujarati, Hindi, Sindhi, and others are in a dismal state, to say nothing of the languages of the Pamirs and northern Pakistan. Even printed books in private collections are fast disappearing, let alone manuscripts and oral histories. Among the foundational resources for any scholar in a field are bibliographies and catalogs. Ismaili studies is particularly well served in this area, beginning with Massignon's Esquisse d'une bibliographie karmate in 1922, Ivanov's pioneering bibliographical surveys in 1933 and 1963, followed by the landmark works of several people in this room, including the disappearing Dr. Poonawala, who we hope will arrive soon on our panel, and of course, Dr. Daftari, Dr. Asani, Dr. Delia Cortese, and many others. In his foreword to one such bibliography, the late Donald Little of McGill University, my former professor, told of graduate students to wish to write about Ismailism, but couldn't because materials were so difficult to identify. He writes tellingly in his foreword, "Obviously, the bibliography will be invaluable for anyone who wants to study Ismailism. Less obviously, perhaps, the bibliography is valuable for what it does not contain. Studies, that is to say, unwritten. In many ways, we know more about the Ismailis of the past, the Fatimids, for example, and Hassan al-Sabah and his followers, than the Ismailis of today." Dr. Daftari's monumental Ismaili literature is a goldmine of sources, reflecting his decades of experience in the field. However, as is natural, the work reflects his own and his predecessors' areas of subject and linguistic expertise. Dr. Daftari omits index sources from the work and alerts us to the need to fill this gap. He writes, "With few exceptions, publications in Gujarati and other Indian languages have been excluded. Ismaili publications in South Asian languages would indeed require a separate annotated bibliography." Over the past many years, I've been preparing the materials for such a bibliography. In the course of this, it's become abundantly clear to me that many sources are rapidly disappearing. As these languages become increasingly marginalized, we continue to lose materials of great value that may never be recovered. As I mentioned, today I'll use Pir Sabzali's example to discuss this. Currently, the most significant scholarly study of Pir Sabzali is an article by Professor Azim Nanji in the Encyclopedia of Islam. Without a doubt, Professor Nanji, the former director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, is one of the leading scholars of South Asian Ismailism. However, the inaccessibility of sources meant even he could only identify 2 references for the bibliography of this 9-sentence article. If resources were not available even to him, we can only imagine the situation of fledgling graduate students wishing to embark on this field. Fortunately, in the bibliography, I've managed to increase the number of citations from 2 to 149 that can be used to reconstruct the life of this figure, demonstrating that these resources do exist and can be harnessed if we choose to preserve them. Who was Pir Sabzali? In brief, he was one of the most significant figures of 20th century Ismailism. Born in Mumbai in 1879, he lost his father at a young age. His widowed mother worried about the wayward teenager and sent him to the Gwadar coast of Balochistan, where he apprenticed with Fârès Muhammad Remu. He became a leading volunteer and brilliant orator. In 1923, he undertook a historic journey to Central Asia to strengthen ties with the faithful in Afghanistan, Tajikistan, China, Hunza, Gilgit, and Chitral. In other journeys, he was also active with the Ismailis in Syria and Africa. The Imam bestowed the posthumous title of Pir on him in 1938. His most important literary achievement was his Gujarati diary, in which he recorded his experiences in Central Asia. The Ismaili, a weekly magazine of Mumbai and one of the most important community publications of the time, serialized these diary entries. How accessible are sources like this? They are almost impossible to lay your hands on. WorldCat, the world's largest union catalog, has some 3 billion holdings across 72,000 libraries and 170 countries. Not a single one had this magazine. It does not exist in major world collections such as the Library of Congress, the British Library, or even the National Library of India. 40% of WorldCat's holdings are in English, numbering some 210 million volumes. This is followed by German, French, and Spanish. only a measly 3.3 million titles are in Arabic. Forget Muslim minorities and minority languages. All Muslim majority languages combined, Arabic, Turkish, Indonesian, Malay, Persian, Urdu, and Bengali, together constitute just 1% of total holdings, which is less than Latin by itself. Just finding out whether this single magazine was in WorldCat's database was a mammoth task. Search engines were not built for languages like Gujarati. Taking into account simple spelling and transliteration variants, I had to search 32 different possibilities for a single magazine title, only to discover that no library had it. I could only locate it in relatively inaccessible private collections. I've been able to obtain perhaps 70 to 80% of the diary issues thus far. Often, just scattered pages have survived, meaning that much valuable contextual information is lost. Often a single copy is insufficient. As you can see from the image I have on screen, parts of pages are often torn, or words are illegible, and so a second copy needs to be found to fill in the gaps. When I do manage to find full issues, they are very revealing. For example, the journal printed Pir Sabzali's diary side by side with Gujarati translations of episodes from Nasir Khusro's famous Persian Safarnameh, clearly drawing a parallel between these two. I'd like you to take a close look at the date here, 1926. This Gujarati piece predates Ivanov's pioneering work on Nasir Khusro by more than 20 years. And the Gujarati translations of Safarnameh predate the first full English translation of the Safarnameh by more than half a century. Ivanov had written of a work called the Silke Gauharis, which he could never find. When I published my book, The Ismailis in the Middle Ages, I was therefore quite proud that it was possibly the first Western scholarly work to make extensive use of this source. However, I was taken down a peg when I read this Gujarati article by a certain Zia, who about 100 years ago was already referring to this work, long before it was known in Western scholarship. How many more such works might have been used in Gujarati scholarship that we have yet to discover in Western academia? One other thing I'd like to note on this slide is the fact that the magazine uses 3 calendar systems: the Western calendar, the Hijri calendar, and the Indian Samvat calendar. Bibliographical software such as EndNote, RefWorks, Zotero, and so on are not built to handle multiple calendar systems in a single citation, compounding the challenges for scholars in this field. Based primarily on these 2 sources, here's a second source for Pir Sabzali's journey, an account by one of his companions published in 1953 in the Platinum Jubilee Bulletin, Mumbai, over the course of 6 weeks. Based primarily on these 2 sources, in 1967, the Ismaili poet S.V. Nur Muhammad serialized a third-person narrative of the journey in the magazine Ismaili Crescent. The copy I have has no cover with publication details, but Hakuna Matata, judging from the advertisements, we can see that it's from East Africa. Nur Muhammad was a talented writer, so Pegham in Pakistan, and reprinted his account, and it finally made full circle when the Ismaili Mumbai reprinted it, 43 years after the same magazine published Pir Sabzali's original account. The Ismaili Association for Tanzania then combined all the issues into a famous book, Pir Sabzali ni Madhya Asia ni Musafri. From Gujarati, the tale traveled to Urdu, and then Tajik and Russian. More information on Pir Sabzali is available in the many elegies published on his death, such as this one by the popular poet Major Lakpati, whose pen name was ʿAhd. In these Gujarati resources, we also find many incidental references to Pir Sabzali's life, such as his leadership role in the Ismaili Library of Karachi, and the nature of the library's collection, which you see on this slide. Importantly, we learn in the article that refreshments were served at the library meetings. I hope it was samosas. The statistics provided in such articles are enlightening. For example, here are many magazine titles to which the Ismaili Library in Karachi subscribed. I should point out that even the National Library of India does not seem to have copies of many of these titles. Pir Sabzali's family members generally shared with me other long-lost primary sources. Here is his passport. On page 9 alone, we see that he traveled to Iran, France, Switzerland, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Austria, and Italy. Here's his mission certificate, which I think provides a practical example of the metadata difficulties I alluded to earlier. You'll notice that his name is spelled 3 different ways in this single document. 4 if we include Gujarati. Next, we have an unpublished typescript entitled History of the Jubilee Insurance Company, 1937 to 1987, by Steve Lawrence, formerly a senior journalist with the Daily Nation. His typescript includes minutes of the meetings from 1937 that demonstrate Pir Sabzali's pivotal role in founding this company, which is today the largest insurance company in all of East Africa. Here on the left, we have his message in the guest book of the Mir of Hunza, and on the right, letters in Pir Sabzali's own handwriting. Legal documents such as this also contain detailed information about the family. Pir Sabzali's story also inspired developments in pop culture. Here, for example, is the program of a Gujarati play on Pir Sabzali by Aziz Ibrahim. He produced and directed some 15 full-length Gujarati plays that I'm aware of, one of the most popular being Mari Bairi Kamalche. My wife is a piece of work. I provide all these examples just to give a taste of the types of riches that are being lost when we don't value sources beyond classical works of history and philosophy in Arabic. From dramas and plays to leading companies on the 3 East Africa stock exchanges, from a significant library network to a travelogue of one of the most significant figures of modern Ismailism, there would be gaping holes in our understanding of the Ismaili community. With the establishment of its Central Asian and South Asian studies units, the IIS is taking a leading role in ensuring that such valuable sources are not lost. To conclude, I'd just like to share with you a short paragraph from Pir Sabzali's Gujarati Safarname, written about 1,000 years after Hakim Nasir Khusraw's Persian Safarname. It gives you a sense of the tremendous literary beauty we risk losing if we don't make greater efforts to preserve these sources. Madrat thai, badhe shanti chhawai gayi hati. Mari સાથે ના બધા માણસો પણ ઊંઘમાં ગિરફ્તાર હતા. It was midnight, and silence enveloped everything. All the members of my convoy slumbered soundly. Only the quiet roar of the waterfall crashing down disturbed the eerie silence. I tried to appease sleep's enchantress with my tossing and turning, but she was displeased, and my efforts to placate her were in vain. Thoughts flooded my mind, thoughts that would return so many times during the journey over the snow-capped mountains. Tomorrow's expedition was to be through those very mountains. That evening, I had heard the strangest tales about these mountains, and such images flashed before my eyes. Thank you.
We will now listen to Jamel Velji, whose presentation is entitled A History of Religion's Approach to Ismaili Studies, Possibilities and Pitfalls.
Good morning, everybody. It is such a great delight to be here today in this space with so many pioneers and luminaries in Ismaili studies. I remain grateful to the IIS for its tremendous work in so many fields. I'm grateful to Dr. Daftari for his leadership of this institute. I thank Dr. Mohammadpour and Dr. Daftari for inviting me here today. I'd like to congratulate Professor Zayn Kassam on her new role as the IIS's director. Zayn is my colleague across the street at Pomona College, and I know that I and so many of us in Claremont and at the Claremont colleges will miss her very much. We will miss her brilliance, her wisdom, and her kindness. These are qualities that the IAS will benefit from tremendously as she begins her role here in January. We'll miss you dearly. So my comments today are framed in response to an increasingly urgent problem we face in the North American Academy, a crisis of the humanities in which programs in philosophy, religious studies, anthropology, and other disciplines are being eliminated at an alarming rate. This is, of course, no surprise to all of us. This is at the expense of the real, quote unquote, work of the sciences or economics or business. An incidental casualty of these shifting disciplinary frameworks is a privileging of the present at the expense of understanding the past. For those of us who study Ismaili materials, there's also the question of the center and the periphery, as Professor Virani's paper so nicely illustrated. How do we make the study of these materials, so often viewed as only incidental to the larger history of Islam, central to people's understanding of the Islamic experience, and also of the past? Today, I wish to take us through a thought experiment using the interpretive framework of Fatimid Ta'wil to address some of these concerns. I'm particularly concerned with highlighting this movement from the Dahir to the Batin via Ta'wil in selections of texts by Qadī al-Numan and Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani, and then theorizing how these examples might dovetail with the notion of myth, a dominant taxon used to analyze phenomena in the history of religions. So first, a brief word about Ta'wil. The ever-growing literature on Ta'wil illuminates a number of key points that we may use as a springboard to begin a discussion of this understudied body of literature. First, we are reminded that Ta'wil is not a static enterprise. As Professor Poonawala has shown, the same symbol may be interpreted in a variety of ways by different authors, indicating not a confusion among these authors, but rather a dynamic process correlated to the notion of spiritual unveiling. Second, and here I'm in dialogue with the work of Henri Corbin, that while the imaginal work of Ta'wil should absolutely be studied as part of the phenomenological and structural architecture of the hidden, it should also be remembered that Ta'wil is a product of its time and place. As such, it cannot be disaggregated for the context in which it is produced. To reduce Ta'wil to an exclusively spiritual enterprise, or to speak about it as something that is exclusively political, is to miss its dynamism as a motive force in a variety of social and religious spheres, including religio-political transformation and the construction and maintenance of sacred boundaries. As such, I wish to propose here that the definition of myth, as articulated by some of its modern expositors, is strikingly similar to that which is symbolized in the Ta'wil. Seen in this way, the process of Ta'wil can be considered as a dynamic myth-making enterprise that can result in the production of a religious transcript that may accomplish a multiplicity of functions through its status as a medium of the disclosure of the originary. Before going any further, I must define my terms. Religionist Kees Bola has defined myth as, quote, an expression of the sacred in words. It reports realities and events from the origin of the world that remain valid as the basis and purpose of all there is. Consequently, a myth functions as a model for human activity, society, wisdom, and knowledge, end quote. Myths are powerful speech acts that are not verifiable empirically. They are distinct from history. According to Ricoeur, myth is a narrative of origins taking place in a primordial time, a time other than that of everyday reality. Yet myth is not politically inert. As Bruce Lincoln states, Lincoln develops a view of myth as ideology in narrative form, and writes that it can be used to modify or normalize taxonomies and hierarchies. To be sure, two very fine examples of myth that have lasting legacies are the famous Quranic verse 7:172, the pre-eternal pact of the Quran that imprints fitra upon all of humanity in its pre-created condition, and John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Here I wish to explore how Ta'wil might be an interpretive modality that bears particular resonance with myth, since Ta'wil is the means, to quote Nanji, quote, by which one arrives at the root of original meaning of revelation, end quote. To see what Ta'wil is doing, I want to look at a few examples to elucidate how some authors move from the Dahir to the Batin. One of my favorite examples is Qadī al-Numan's Asas al-Ta'wil's discussion of Noah's Ark. He writes, quote, Noah built the Ark as an example for a foundation. This is the Asas, the rank of the Dawah, just after the speaker prophet, who is the custodian of hidden knowledge, of his Dawah, and set up its borders, its hudud, to establish the batin by the command of God, to save believers through the life of spiritually enlightened knowledge from drowning in ignorance and error, just as the ark in the Dahir is a refuge from the literal drowning. And so, by the Asas, he built a foundation for his dawah and his hudud, and set up the dawah for the believers through the storehouses of hidden knowledge. And he made the manifest ark a proof by which believers are shown the way, and as a likeness for his batin, end quote. We all know the story of the ark as one in which true believers, the minority of people who adhere to God's word, are saved, and the majority of people who refuse to believe in the truth are not. Just as the Quran valorizes the idea of those on the ark possessing true knowledge, al-Numan's interpretive framework illuminates a worldview in which the ark signifies and valorizes knowledge of the batin. The ark's borders are likened to the batin, to hidden knowledge, and function both as barriers to the outside, to the unsaved masses, and as a hierarchical system of a particular structure ordering that knowledge. Those within the ark are surrounded by and saved through the spiritually enlightened knowledge dispensed by the Asas and the Dawah. The majority of this text, in fact, is concerned with the ascribing and delineating of an esoteric hierarchy to Quranic and extra-Quranic sources. It frequently emphasizes the importance of the batin, as well as delineates a clear hierarchy of the dawah. Those in this particular time and in this particular place are now inheritors of the disclosure of the true knowledge of the past. Only at this moment of al-Numan's disclosure does this story acquire true meaning for true believers. Rituals associated with washing of the dead too become tethered to spiritual ascent under the guidance of members of the Dawah via ta'wil. The Daim, for instance, and this is Professor Poonawala's translation, states, quote, the Imam said Ali bathed him, Muhammad, 3 times, first with potash mixed with water, second with aromatic water perfumed with sweet-smelling rush and camphor, and lastly with water pure and simple, end quote. After stating that this has become sunnah in the Dahir, the Ta'wil al-Daim, this is the esoteric analog of the Daim al-Islām, states, quote, that the likeness of washing the dead with water in each of these 3 washings is the likeness of the successive phases of purification of the mover by his movement through 3 spiritual levels of the dawah. The ascent through each of these levels corresponds to the acquisition of spiritual knowledge, as well as both the awareness of this individual's process of rising and progressive obviation of the doubt that he might have in the process. Even when one moves from this world to the next, we see an esoteric analog in the Ta'wil al-Daim. This is, quote, the likeness of the movement for the believer from spiritual level ḥadd to spiritual level ḥadd in the dawah of truth. These spiritual transcripts seem to invert the finality associated with death itself, while reifying the structure and function of the dawah. Note how the simultaneous invocation of signified and signifier via ta'wil, which through its very structure valorizes what is hidden and prior to history, can operate to create powerful new frames of reference for viewing and existing in the world. We see this as illustrated by some of the works of al-Numan, but what about for other authors who deployed this the idea of ta'wil? For Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani, and this is from the Maqalid, the difference between the coming down, the tanzil, and the ta'wil is the difference between things in their natural state, like wood, gold, iron, and the like, and the making apparent the eminence of the natural things, and to lead to their intended beneficial uses. And let me thank 2 members of this panel, Professor Walker for his really clear discussion of this in early philosophical Shi'ism, and Professor Poonawala's terrific edition of the Maqalid. In the interpretive arena, it is the role of the interpreter to uncover the hidden meanings within the text, to forge proper comparison, and to draw out proper analogies for believers. It is clear from Sijistani's discussion that those authorized to produce ta'wil must be few in number, and they are among the elect. But in exemplifying his ta'wil of Quran 24:35, the famous light verse of the Quran, he offers a ta'wil that bears strikingly on historical events. He writes, "And as for the ta'wil in the phrase, whose oil almost gives light even when no fire touches it, he means by this Muhammad al-Baqir, who almost manifested himself and spread his da'wah, seeking to revenge the blood of his father. But he did not do this, so he left this to his brother, Zayn ibn Ali. And the ta'wil of the word fire, he means by this Ja'far Sadiq, who sat among different groups of the ummah to help each one of them according to their ability to grasp knowledge. This is like the fire which avails itself of all naturally and manufactured things. The light refers to his son, because he is concealed and hidden, since the light glitters in the souls of the friends of God secretly, without manifesting light. Upon light means the Qa'im, in whom the lights have disappeared, and yet from him the light will rise, and by him the earth and what is on it will radiate. Thus he says, God guides whoever he will to his light. God draws such comparisons for people. God has full knowledge of everything. So this is the work of ta'wil for this ayat. So here we have ta'wil that points specifically to historical events. This directly contradicts some of the definitions of myth above. So what do we do with this? This inscribes a secret genealogy that takes place squarely within time. And so does this mean that the analogy between myth and ta'wil is incorrect? Is this whole exercise useless? Well, yes, it is. And now I may sit down. No, just kidding. Okay, I would actually argue here that this heuristic analogy should not be discarded. Rather, should prompt historians of religion to think about myth more broadly as a spatially unique and temporally dynamic world-building enterprise whose motive force comes from authoritative disclosures, and perhaps in this case, a sense of secrecy. These disclosures provided a multiplicity of religio-spiritual and political itineraries for believers, and so I believe they provide powerful and interesting data for comparative work. This observation would be refined through the examination of ta'wil by other Fatimid authors, al-Mu'ayyad, for instance, as Professor Qutbuddin has done so admirably in her work, and would be sharpened by the examination of authors of around the same period who did not necessarily identify as Fatimid as such, but who used the vocabulary of the Dahir and the Batin to disclose what they experienced of the hidden realm. It would also benefit from those like al-Ghazali, who were not fans of ta'wil. And it would be sharpened through an examination of how this body of literature differs from other genres of esoteric literature, esoteric in quotes, like what we call various genres of Sufi literature. In this way, students would be exposed to both the idea of myth and how it might be iterated by the Fatimids and their contemporaries to add to our understanding of some of the foundational religious transcripts of humankind. But there are pitfalls. Having articulated a comparative approach to ta'wil as myth, I want to now point out one critical pitfall with this comparative hermeneutic. And there's not just one, there are many, and we can talk about those. Here it is. In any comparative endeavor, the comparison necessarily precludes a fuller excavation of the particular phenomenon. So data is generated in service of the category, here myth or ta'wil, rather than in service of the particular thinker or tradition. But this challenge to dominant disciplinary contours is, I think, long overdue in the study of religion. These dominant frameworks, taxonomic structures like myth, ritual, symbol, charisma, space, and affect were largely generated by and codified through the study of Christian religious traditions and their encounter with the other. To infuse these categories with data from Islamic religious traditions, and in particular data from Ismaili religious traditions, would, I think, go a very long way toward normalizing the periphery, indeed toward codifying it, maybe even making it center, in addition to illuminating the truly diverse experiences of Islamic religious traditions and, more broadly, of humankind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Velji. We will now listen to Professor Poonawala, who has joined us, and his presentation is entitled taking stock of extant Ismaili manuscripts and the state of their publications, indicating the progress in Ismaili studies.
First of all, I would like to apologize that the topic of the paper has changed because of my health issues, and so I would like, instead of that, because still that paper is under progress and it is moving little slowly, so I will present the ʿAhd of Ali in Qadī Nu'man's al-Islām under scrutiny. So, in short, in a celebrated book on Ismaili law entitled al-Islām, The Pillars of Islam, Al-Qadī al-Nu'man has incorporated the full version of a document called the ʿAhd of Ali. It is a long document placed around the middle of the last chapter titled Kitab al-Jihad, the book on jihad, in the first volume of the Da'aim, which deals with the primary section of Islamic law, namely ibadat, acts of devotion and religious observances. The following study aims at reviewing the progress made in its thorough scrutiny by Gerald Salinger, Wadad al-Qadī, and Heinz Halm. Their investigations have led them to arrive at new disclosures that the prototype of the ʿAhd ascribed to Ali, both in the Da'aim and in Nahj al-Balagha, originated in Khurasan. So, in a celebrated book on Ismaili law entitled al-Islām, The Pillars of Islam, Al-Qadī Nu'man has incorporated the full version of a document called ʿAhd of Ali. It is a long document placed around the middle of the last chapter and titled Kitab al-Jihad in the first volume of the Da'aim, which deals with the primary section of Islamic law, namely ibadat, acts of worship, acts of devotion and religious observances. Although it is an important early Muslim political document which expresses Islamic concepts of rulership, it is not easily accessible to ordinary readers, even in its English translation, since it is not published separately. The following study aims at reviewing the progress made in its thorough scrutiny by Gerald Salinger, Wadad al-Qadī, and Heinz Halm. Their investigations have led them to arrive at new disclosures that the prototype of the ʿAhd ascribed to Ali, both in the Da'aim and in the Nahj al-Balagha, originated in Khurasan. Its two versions of transmission, that is the North African version in the Da'aim and the Iraqi version in the Nahj al-Balagha, represent revised recension of the prototype. In fact, the Da'aim's reproduction betrays the power struggle between the Fatimid Caliph Imam al-Mahdi and his chief Da'i and the commander Abu Abdullah al-Shi'i. The investigations of the above scholars were published in different journals in English and German at intermittent intervals of time. The following pages are therefore devoted to gather together all piecemeal information in one concise article, so that the interests of scholars and ordinary readers will be able to access and evaluate study progress in Ismaili studies during the last half a century. So the ʿAhd of Ali in the Da'a'im was probably analyzed and translated into English by Gerald Salinger after the publication of Kitab al-Jihad by Qadī and by Al-Fayzi in 1951. And 2 years later, in 1953, the Gerald Salinger translated the Kitab al-Jihad from the Da'a'im with an introduction and notes as his PhD dissertation and submitted it to Columbia University in New York. 3 years later, in 1956, he published an article entitled A Muslim Mirror for Princes, with full translation of the ʿAhd of Ali, except its 5th section entitled What is proper for the governor to observe concerning the affairs of his army. This is in Salinger paper published in 1956. In the introduction to the above article, Salinger observes that the ʿAhd document ascribed to Ali is quite long, about 18 pages of Arabic text divided into 12 sections with appropriate headings. He also states that it represents a 10th century expression of a political desiderata of early Islam. He further adds a significant note that a different version of the above ʿAhd can also be found in Nahj al-Balagha, the well-known compilation of Sharif al-Radi, edited by Muhammad Abdu at that time, because Salinger was unable to consult the later edition of Nahj al-Balagha. So these two versions represented in the al-Islam and the Nahj al-Balagha offers certain sidelights of some political significance, but space does not allow him to discuss here. That is, in the above-mentioned article, it was an important suggestion for the future line of research, which we will see below, was taken up by Wadad al-Qadī. What is noteworthy for our purpose is his critical remark about the ʿAhd, meaning of the Salinger, which states that considering its contents, it is very doubtful that it could have been written by Ali, whose reign was very short and full of internal bloody conflict. So now let us return to Ad-Nu'man's. According to him, the ʿAhd had come down from Ali, and that the latter traced it back to the Prophet. The text of the preamble reads, I skipped that. So the first paragraph of the first section, which also comes in the Nahj al-Balagha, reads, O King of men but slave of God, recollect your former status and consider what you have done, what you have come to. Build your faith on that which lasts. Take heed for the future by considering what has happened in the past. Begin by giving good counsel to your conscience. Consider that matters pertaining to your own self and understand your duties and your rights. His own actions are the best vindication for a man concerning his due in the presence of God, and his own works are the best vindication for him concerning his due with mankind, and goes on. So this is taken from Da'im al-Islam. So the first paragraph of the second section of this passage reads, Consider, O you who have been made sovereign over men and are yet a slave of God. Where are your forefathers? And where are the kings and the sons of kings, enemies of yours, who have been devouring the world since its beginning? You enjoy only their livings and governors as they governed. Where are the treasurers The treasures they gathered and the bodies they gratified, and their sons whom they honored. Do you see anyone so bereft of offspring or deprived of remembrance? When God favors you with his bounties, recollect what you used to hope for. Let not your passion overpower you by your fortune, and let not your indulgence of your children lead you to garner for them more than what is allotted to them by God and what has intended them to obtain, lest it lead to your own perdition for the benefit of someone else, and lest it cause you to fall from the grace of God for the happiness and sensual delights of one your superior, who neither stands by you nor shares your sorrow. This is quote from Qadī Nu'man. As stated above, the full text of the ʿAhd of Ali, with some variation in its wordings, except the preamble and the first two sections, is also preserved by Sharif al-Radi in his recension of Nahj al-Balagha, with the heading from Ali's written letter which he wrote for Malik al-Ashtar al-Nakhai, may God have mercy on him, when the latter was appointed as governor of Egypt and the surrounding areas, when the position of Muhammad bin Abi Bakr, the previous governor of Egypt, became precarious. It is the longest document written by Ali and contains the greatest number of good qualities. The āhd's recension in the Nahj therefore presents striking differences as well as close similarities to the text of the Da'im. It should be noted that the Da'im's version does not disclose the occasion of writing, while the Nahj clearly states that it was written by Ali when he appointed Malik al-Ashtar as the governor of Egypt. So this gives you a clear idea from the Nahj. So before we proceed further, it is appropriate to summarize the contents of the art document of Ali as presented by An-Nu'man. It comprises of 12 sections, each introduced by appropriate heading, and could also be divided into three broad categories: an introductory emotional exhortation to the addressee, the ruler, to look carefully at his present status and compare it with his previous humble standing. These are sections 1 and 2 listed below. Number 2, the main body of the āhd, giving advice to the ruler. These are the section 3 to 11. The main body of the āhd giving advice to the ruler. They are sections 3 to 11. And third, the concluding part with the heading manners and virtues, conduct which the governor should adopt. So I won't go into the details of all the sections. The 12 sections are nicely, so to say, divided. And 20 years later, Wadad al-Qadī followed the clues indicated by Salinger and pursued very close comparison between the two versions of Ali's āhd, one recorded by An-Nu'man in the Da'im and the other documented by Sharif al-Radi in his Nahj al-Balagha. Let me summarize the important points in her findings as follows and then conclude. The āhd of Ali is a political testament of Ali, is inserted towards the middle of the chapter on jihad, which has absolutely no relation with the topic. Hence, she will examine it thoroughly and relocate it within the correct context of its composition in the critical years of the Fatimid spent in North Africa before they established themselves in Egypt. So I leave that aside her analysis and other things. So first, the Lev, Yaakov Lev, who read this article, he made a pertinent remarks about Qadī Wadad's article in his book State and Society in Fatimid Egypt. So first, Lev applauds Qadī's efforts for thoroughly analyzing the text of the ʿAhd dealing with the political organization of the state and affirms that it is an important contribution to the discussion of the Ismaili character of the Fatimid state. He further compliments her for concluding her research that although the document belongs to the mirror of Prince John, it betrays Fatimid political thinking and contains original ideas. The political order envisaged there is highly centralized and consists of three entities: God, ruler, and the rest. So, leaving that aside, I think Heinz Hull made some important remarks. Who is the leading scholar, I think, in the pre-Fatimid Ismaili movement, and the cosmology of the early Ismailis, and his latest book, Das Reich des Mahdi, der Aufstieg der Fatimiden, meaning the Fatimid Empire, the rise of the Fatimid. He elaborates further the question of the rift that had occurred very early between the two antagonists soon after the Da'i had rescued al-Mahdi from prison in Sijil Masa. Disagreeing between the Caliph and the chief Qadī, chief Da'i, the commander Abu Abdullah al-Shi'i. This section, she has gathered scattered information from Ismaili and non-Ismaili sources, mainly from three works of Qadī Nu'man's Iftitah al-Da'wa, then Ibn al-Izari's Bayan al-Maghrib fi Akhbar al-Muluk al-Andalus, and then Qadī Abdul Jabbar Tasbit Dala'il al-Nubuwa. So the period of discord and conflict was very short between the Mahdi and the chief Da'i, barely lasting 1 year. I have given the dates and other things. So when Mahdi intended to depart from Sijil Masa, where he had spent 5 years, then to Claremont, North Africans and the companions of Abu Abdullah entered the residence of Mahdi to take his men out. They found around Mahdi silk and brocade clothing, gold and silver vessels, Greek eunuchs, and indications of the use of alcohol. In their Berber simplicity, they disapproved of all this, and they asked the Da'i Abu Abdullah about it, for he had spent many years among the Kutama while recruiting among them for the Mahdi. The guarantor Hujjah of the god, claiming to be his man, but Abu Abdullah lived an ascetic life, clothed himself in coarse garments, and took his sustenance from wood, and he prophesied the same sort of things to them concerning the Mahdi. Because of that, they disapproved what they saw and asked the Da'i, and Abu Abdullah said, these are the traces of his companions and followers, just to put an excuse. He had many followers. So anyhow, I think Heinz Helms has followed this in this Qadī Nu'man's Iftitah al-Da'wa, and there are heated debates, I think, between the Mahdi and the Abu Abdullah, and I think then also he refers to the Qadī Abdul Jabbar's Tasbit Dala'il al-Nubuwa, which gives quite a different picture, and I would like to I think, conclude this stormy audience with Al-Mahdi as the spokesman, the Supreme Sheikh Harun, they done away with it in secret. The other conspirators now pressed for action that Mahdi should be eliminated by assassination. The Dai Abu Abdullah wavered indecisively, but his brother Abu Abbas said to someone who blamed him concerning that, by God, we shall not allow anyone else to live in a building which we built with our own hands, for which we toil, and where our lives were spent while we remain behind the doors. Anyhow, there was a stormy session between these people and Abu Zaki and other things, and I think the Da'i and the Kutama chieftains repeatedly expressed their feeling of having been set aside. They bitterly recalled how Mahdi had taken the funds hoarded in Ikjan for himself. The use of functionaries from the old regime made for especially bad blood. In short, this confrontation, I think, between the two antagonists, that I conclude the power struggle between Mahdi and the chief Da'i, Abu Abdullah al-Shi'i, described above, is well documented both in the Ismaili and non-Ismaili sources. In my modest view, this case of power struggle was not a simple bickering between the two powerful antagonists, but was a fundamental clash between the two commanding institutions for political power and control of the central authority. The Dawa organization, established long before the Mahdi's birth, on the one hand, and the newly installed Mahdi at the head of the newly created state, on the other hand. In reality, it was the Dawa organization headed by the chief Da'i and his hard work for 16 years among the Kutama tribe that had paved the way to establish the Fatimid state. The Dawa had declared the advent of the awaited Mahdi, a messianic, righteous figure. Very soon, his luxurious lifestyle and demeanor rubbed the wrong way not only the chief Da'i but also the Kutama chieftains. Since they had certain expectations from the Mahdi, they were totally disappointed with him and openly expressed their displeasure and doubts as to whether he was the real Mahdi as promised by the chief Da'i and impostor. The disgruntled group that included the chief Da'i and his prominent supporters gathered together and debated the issue how to get rid of the impostor, meaning the Mahdi. But due to the chief Da'i's hesitation to act decisively, or that his supporters were not united on their plan for action, the Mahdi was able to buy time and plot in Machiavellian way to eliminate the leading opposition. And that's how I think this whole thing ended, that Mahdi was able to get rid of the Da'is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Poonawala.